sat in the back row of the lecture hall and tried to make herself invisible. That was her usual strategy at the Galactic Academy of Survival Sciences. She had been here for 6 months now, and she still felt like an outsider. The other students were taller, stronger, and came from worlds that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. She was just a human from a small town in Minnesota. Her hall was filled with students from dozens of different species. You could see the feathered sitting near the front, their colorful plumes catching the light whenever they moved. The four-armed occupied the middle rows, their bodies built like tanks. The scales stood along the walls because they preferred not to sit. Everyone seemed confident and capable. Everyone kept her. Instructor walked onto the stage. He was tall and covered in dark green scales that shimmered when he moved. His yellow eyes swept across the room with cold authority. Had never seen him smile. She was not sure his face could make that shape. The room fell silent immediately. Instructor had that effect on people. He began to speak in his deep, rumbling voice. The translator and seer converted his words into English with a slight delay. He announced that the final evaluation of the semester would take place in 3 days. This evaluation would determine their ranking and their future placement in galactic service. Her stomach tight. She had barely passed the previous evaluation. Her scores and strength tests were laughable compared to the other species. Her speed was average at best. The only reason she was still here was because the Academy had accepted a single human as part of a cultural exchange program. She suspected they expected her to fail quietly and go home. Her explained that the evaluation would be different from anything they had faced before. It would take place on Seven, a frozen moon in a nearby system. The students would enter something called the Labyrinth, an ancient maze carved from glacial ice. They would have to navigate through the maze alone and reach the exit within the time limit. Anyone who failed to finish or who required rescue would receive the lowest marks. Or went through the crowd, noticed that many students looked uncomfortable, but were whispering to each other with obvious concern. Even the confidence seemed uneasy. Understood why? Most species in the galaxy came from warm or temperate worlds. Extreme cold was rare in the inhabited regions of space. Ice was something they studied in textbooks, not something they experienced in daily life. Had grown up in Minnesota. She knew cold. She knew ice. She knew winters that lasted for months and lakes that froze solid enough to drive cars across them. She had been skating on frozen ponds since she was 4 years old. The first time since arriving at the academy, she felt something that might have been hope. Instructor continued with the rules. Students would wear standard thermal suits to prevent death from exposure, but they would not receive any specialized equipment for traveling on ice. The academy wanted to test their natural ability to adapt to unfamiliar terrain. They would enter the maze one at a time, alone, with no communication devices and no assistant. Near the front raised his hand. His name was Nix and knew him well. He was considered the top student in their class, and he never let anyone forget it. His feathers were bright blue and gold, and he carried himself like royalty. He had made fun of on multiple occasions, calling humans primitive and wondering out loud how our species had even survived long enough to reach space. He asked instructor if there would be any accommodation for species that were not adapted to cold environments. Instructor's yellow eyes narrowed. He said that the entire point of the evaluation was to test their ability to survive in conditions they were not adapted to. The galaxy was full of hostile environments. A survival specialist who could only function in comfortable conditions was worthless. He sat back down, his feathers ruffled with irritation. The briefing ended, students filed out of the lecture hall in small groups, heard them talking nervously about the evaluation. Some were already making plans to study ice environments. Others were complaining that the test was unfair. Walked alone toward the dormitory section of the academy. She was used to walking alone. A voice called out behind her. She turned and saw approaching. Was a with gray skin and 4 muscular arms. Unlike most, she was friendly toward. They had been partnered together on a few training exercises and had never treated her like she was inferior. Then stepped aside and asked if she was worried about the evaluation. Her translator gave her voice a warm, musical quality. About the question, she said she was not sure yet. She wanted to see the maze before he decided how worried to be. She said that was either very brave or very foolish. Most students were already terrified and they had not even seen the maze yet. Walked in comfortable silence for a moment, then asked a question. She wanted to know if it was true that humans came from a world with extreme temperature changes. She had read that Earth had regions where water froze solid for months at a time. She explained that where she grew up, the winters were very cold. The lakes would freeze and she would skate on them almost every day. It was one of her favorite things to do as a child. Confused, she asked what skating meant. To explain, she said it was a way of moving on ice. You wore spell shoes with blades on the bottom and you glided across the frozen surface. It was fast and smooth, almost like flying. Her head in amazement. She said that on her world, ice was considered extremely dangerous. No one would ever think of moving across it on purpose. Well, she said that on Earth, children learned to play on ice before they learned algebra. It was just part of growing up in certain places. Reached the dormitory section and said goodbye. As walked to her small room, she thought about what it said. She thought about all the alien students who had never touched ice in their lives, who had never felt the joy of gliding across a frozen lake with the cold wind on their face. For the first time since arriving at the academy, did not feel like the weakest person in the room. In 3 days, she would enter the labyrinth, and maybe, just maybe, she would show the galaxy what a human from Minnesota could do. Port shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere of Set, pressed her face against the small window, and watched the frozen landscape grow larger beneath them. The entire moon was covered in ice. Massive glaciers stretched from horizon to horizon, broken only by jagged mountain ranges that looked like teeth made of crystal. It was beautiful in a harsh and unforgiving way. The students sat in their seats with varying degrees of nervousness. They huddled together for warmth even though the shuttle's interior was heated. They sat rigidly, their forearms crossed over their chests. They stood near the back, their scales dull and their movements sluggish. Cold-blooded species always struggled in cold environments. Trained to calm, the frozen landscape outside the window reminded her of home. Not exactly the same, of course. Minnesota did not have mountains made of pure ice or skis that glowed purple from the nearby gas giant, but the feeling was familiar, the sense of a world locked in winter, waiting patiently for anyone brave enough to step outside. Shuttle landed on a platform carved into the ice. Students filed out one by one, their thermal suits activating automatically as they stepped into the freeing air. Felt the suit warm against her skin, but she could still sense the cold pressing in from all sides. It was not uncomfortable. It felt like coming home. The instructor was waiting for them on the platform. His scales had turned a dark shade of green, and his movements were slower than usual. Realized that even with his thermal suit, the cold was affecting him. We're not built for places like this. Led them toward a massive structure that rose from the ice like a frozen cathedral, the labyrinth. It was ancient, carved from glacial ice thousands of years ago by a species that no longer existed. No one knew why they had built it. Some researchers thought it was a temple, others believed it was a prison. The Academy used it because it was the most challenging ice environment in the sector. It was a simple archway cut into the ice. Beyond it could see a corridor that curved away into darkness. The walls were smooth and blue, polished by centuries of wind and time. The floor was a sheet of pure ice, flat and gleaming under the pale light. The instructor began explaining the rules again for anyone who had not been paying attention. Students would enter one at a time with 5-minute intervals between them. They would wear their thermal suits and nothing else. No specialized equipment, no climbing gear, no communication devices. They would navigate through the maze using only their natural abilities and reach the exit beacon at the center. The time limit was 4 hours. One who failed to reach the exit or who activated their emergency beacon would receive failing marks. A pair of boots. They were standard issue Academy footwear, designed to work in any environment. The soles were hard and smooth, made from a synthetic material that was durable but offered no grip on slick surfaces. Instructor explained that these boots would be their only footwear for the evaluation. No modifications were allowed. Looked at the boots carefully. She understood immediately why the Academy had chosen them. On normal ground, they would be fine. On ice, they would be a disaster. The smooth soles would slide on the frozen surface, making every step dangerous. Most species would struggle to even walk, let alone move quickly. Something else? The smooth soles were not so different from ice skate. Not exactly the same, of course. Real skates had blades that cut into the ice and provided control. These boots would slide more unpredictably, but for someone who had spent years learning to balance on slippery surfaces, they might actually be an advantage. Order of entry was determined by random selection. Drew the last position. She would enter the maze after everyone else. This meant she would have less time before the deadline, but it also meant she could watch how the others performed. Drew the first position. He stepped forward with his usual arrogance, his blue and gold feathers puffed out to make himself look larger. He announced loudly that he would set a record time and prove once again why we're the superior species. Onto the ice at the entrance of the maze. His first step was confident. His second step was less so. By his third step, he was windmilling his arms wildly, trying to stay upright. His taloned feet had no traction on the smooth surface. He shuffled forward awkwardly, his feathers flat against his body now, all his confidence gone. As Nick disappeared around the corner, moving at a painfully slow pace, she could hear him squawking in frustration long after he vanished from sight. The students entered one by one. The results were similar. They used their forearms to brace themselves against the walls, but their heavy bodies worked against them. Every step was a struggle. They moved like they were walking on broken glass, their cold, slowed reflexes making balance almost impossible. The maze about halfway through the order. She moved carefully, using her multiple arms to steady herself. She was doing better than most, but her progress was still painfully slow. She looked back at before she rounded the first corner and gave her a worried wave. It was turn. She was the last student to enter. The instructor looked at her with something that might have been pity. He told her that she had 3 hours and 40 minutes remaining before the deadline. He said it like he expected her to fail immediately. Onto the ice, she felt the familiar slickness beneath her feet. Her body remembered what to do even before her mind caught up. She bent her knees slightly, lowered her center of gravity, and shifted her weight onto the balls of her feet. She off gently with one foot. The smooth sole of her boot slid across the ice and she glided forward. It was not perfect. The boot did not have blades, so she could not dig into the surface for control, but she could work with it. She could use her momentum, lean in turns, push off walls when she needed to change direction. Picked up speed, the corridor curved ahead of her and she leaned into the turn, letting the ice carry her around the bend. Cold air rushed past her face. Her thermal suit kept her warm, but she could feel the frozen world around her, familiar and welcoming. And her, the entrance of the maze grew smaller. Ahead of her, the labyrinth weighed with all its challenges. For the first time in months, she felt like she belonged somewhere. She pushed off again and glided deeper into the ice. The labyrinth was vast, glided through corridors of ancient ice, her boots sliding smoothly across the frozen floor. The walls rose high on either side of her, carved from glacial ice that had been forming for millions of years. The blue glow of the ice made everything feel dreamlike, as if she had stepped into another world entirely. Move quickly now, gaining confidence with every passing minute. Her body remembered the rhythms of skating even though she was not wearing proper skates. Push, glide, lean into the turns. Keep your weight centered. Trust the ice to carry you forward. Maze branched constantly. Every few hundred meters, she would reach an intersection where 2 or 3 corridors split off in different directions. She had no map, no guidance. She chose her path based on instinct, always moving toward what felt like the center of the maze. Came around a corner and found Nyx, that was pressed against the wall, his talons scraping uselessly against the ice as he tried to stay upright. His colorful feathers were damp with condensation, and his beak was open as he panted from exertion. He had made it perhaps 500 meters into the maze. Saw approaching, and his eyes went wide. She could see him trying to understand what he was seeing. A human moving across the ice with ease while he could barely stand. Not slow down. She angled her body and glided past him without stopping. She heard him make a sound of disbelief behind her, a squawk that echoed off the frozen walls. She did not look back. It grew more complex as she moved deeper. Some corridors were wide and straight. Others were narrow and winding, forcing her to slow down and navigate carefully. The floor was not always level. Sometimes it sloped upward and she had to work harder to maintain her momentum. Sometimes it sloped downward and she had to control her speed to avoid going too fast. Counted more students as she went. I was crawling on all 6 limbs, using her 4 arms and 2 legs to spread her weight across the ice. She was making progress, but it was painfully slow. A pair of had given up entirely and were sitting against a wall, their scales almost black from the cold. They would probably have to activate their emergency beacon soon. To them all, she was not being cruel. She simply could not afford to stop. The clock was running and she was starting from behind. Every minute counted. Maze threw new challenges at her. She entered a section where the walls were not solid. Wind tunnels had been carved through the ice, and freezing air blasted through at irregular intervals. The gusts were strong enough to knock a person off their feet if they were not prepared. The pattern for a moment. The gusts came from different tunnels at different times, but there was a rhythm to it. She counted the beats in her head, tying her movements to slip between the blasts of wind. Push, glide, wait, push, glide, wait. She made it through the section without being knocked down once. The section was worse. The floor here was not flat. It was covered in ridges and bumps, frozen waves of ice that had formed when the labyrinth was created. Walking on this surface would be almost impossible. The boots would catch on every ridge, and anyone trying to walk would trip constantly. was not walking, she was gliding, and gliding over bumpy ice was something she had done hundreds of times on the frozen lakes back home. The trick was to keep your weight back and let your feet follow the contours of the surface. Do not fight the bumps, flow over them. Made it through the ridge section faster than any of the flat corridors. The bumps actually helped, giving her something to put against for extra speed. It was deep in the maze now. The corridors were narrower, the ice older and more brittle. She could hear it growing around her, the ancient structure settling under its own weight. She tried not to think about what would happen if the walls decided to collapse. Came round a corner and almost collided with. There was pressed against a wall at a narrow passage, her forearms braced against the ice to keep herself from sliding backward. She looked exhausted and frustrated, but her eyes lit up when she saw. As Tao was moving so fast, she said it was impossible. No one should be able to move on ice like that. Slow down and stopped beside her friend. She knew she should keep going. Every second mattered, but she could not leave stuck here. Explained quickly, she told not to try to walk normally. The smooth boots would never grip the ice. Instead, she should shuffle sideways, keying her feet flat against the surface and sliding them in small movement. It was slow, but it was stable. She would not fall if she kept her center of gravity low and her movement small. Her first few shells were awkward, but she stayed upright. She moved forward slowly, her forearms still touching the walls for balance, but making real progress now. Told her to keep going. She said she would see her at the exit. Without her thanks, pushed off and glided away. The narrow passage opened into a wider corridor and picked up speed again. Had lost May 2 minutes helping. She hoped it would not cost her the evaluation, but even if it did, she did not regret stopping. Some things were more important than winning. Maze continued. More corridors, more branches, more frozen challenges. Kept moving, kept gliding, kept trusting the ice to carry her forward. She could feel herself getting closer to the center. The air was colder here, the ice older, the silence deeper. Rounded a final corner and saw something that made her breath catch. The corridor ahead sloped sharply downward, driving at least 50 meters before leveling out again. It was essentially a frozen slide, a death trap for anyone who could not control their speed on ice. Looked at the slope for a long moment. Then she bent her knees, tucked her arms close to her body and pushed off. Flew down the slope like a bullet, the ice blurring beneath her feet. The cold air screamed past her face. She leaned into the descent, making tiny adjustments to her balance, controlling her trajectory with the skill of someone who had been doing this her entire life. Reached the bottom and leveled out smoothly, her speed gradually decreasing as the corridor flattened. Her heart was pounding, but she was smiling. Ahead of her she could see a faint glow, the exit beacon. She was almost there. Exit beacon glowed blue in the distance, a pillar of light that marked the end of the maze. Could see it clearly now, maybe 200 meters away across a vast frozen chamber. She had made it to the heart of the labyrinth. She was almost done. Thing was wrong. The chamber ahead was different from the corridors she had been traveling through. The floor was not a solid sheet of ice. It was broken into sections, like puzzle pieces floating on a dark sea. The gaps between the sections were filled with shadow, and could hear water moving somewhere far below. Ancient meltwater, flowing through channels carved into the glacier over millions of years. Stopped at the edge of the chamber and studied the terrain. The ice sections were stable, but they were not connected. Some were close together, only a meter or two apart. Others were separated by gaps of 5 meters or more. The sections themselves were solid, but the gaps between them would swallow anyone who fell. It was the final test, not just balance, not just speed. This required precision jumping, the ability to land on ice and stay upright, the skill to judge distances and commit fully to each leap. One mistake would send her plunging into the freezing darkness below. Practice jumps on ice. Every skater did. Landing on a slippery surface was one of the hardest skills to master. You had to absorb the impact with your knees, keep your weight centered, and trust your balance to hold even when your feet wanted to slide out from under you. Looked at the path ahead. The first gap was narrow, maybe a meter wide. She could handle that easily. The second gap was wider, almost 2 meters, still manageable. But farther ahead, she could see sections separated by 4 or 5 meters of empty space. Those jumps would push her limits. She took a deep breath and began. First jump was simple. She pushed off, flew across the gap, and landed smoothly on the next ice section. Her knees bent to absorb the impact, and she stayed perfectly balanced. She did not even wobble. Second jump was harder. She needed more speed, more commitment. She glided to the edge of the section, pushed off hard with her back foot, and launched herself across the gap. She landed with more force this time, and her boots slid a few centimeters before she regained control. But she stayed upright. Kept moving. Jump, land, stabilize. Jump, land, stabilize. Each leap required complete focus, complete trust in her body to do what it had learned through years of practice. She could not hesitate. Hesitation would kill her. Heard sounds behind her. Other students had reached the final chamber. She glanced back and saw 2 standing at the edge, staring at the broken ice with expressions of horror. One of them tried to jump to the first section, but their heavy body came down too hard and they slipped immediately, barely catching themselves before sliding into the gap. Back to her own path. She could not help them now. The jumps ahead required all her concentration. Reached a section where the next safe ice was almost 4 meters away. It was the longest gap she had faced. She would need to build real speed before the jump, and she would need to land perfectly or she would slide right off the other side. Retreated to the far edge of her current section. She had made 10 meters of space to build momentum. It would have to be enough. Started gliding, pushing hard with each stroke, building speed. The edge of the section rushed toward her. She planted her foot at the last possible moment and launched herself into the air. Seemed to slow. She was flying over the dark gap, the cold air rushing past her, the distant sound of water far below. She could see the landing section approaching, could already feel herself calculating the angle, the speed, the impact. Landed. Her boots hit the ice and slid backward. She dropped her weight, bent her knees almost to a crouch, and threw her arms forward for balance. For one terrifying moment, she thought she was going to slide off the edge, but her body remembered what to do. She shifted her weight, dug in with her heels, and stopped herself with centimeters to spare. She was breathing hard now. Her legs were starting to burn from the constant effort, but she could not stop. The exit beacon was closer now, maybe 70 meters away. A few more jumps and she would be there. Heard a splash behind her. Someone had fallen into one of the gaps. The sound of emergency beacons activating filled the chamber, high-pitched wails that echoed off the frozen walls. More students were giving up, calling for rescue rather than risk the deadly jumps. Forward, the next gap was moderate, 3 meters. She cleared it cleanly. The one after that was smaller, barely 2 meters, almost easy after what she had just done. Final gap remained. It was wide, almost 5 meters, the largest in the entire chamber. The ice section on the other side led directly to the exit platform where the beak stood. This was the last obstacle between her and the finish line. Looked at the gap for a long moment. 5 meters was far farther than anything she had jumped before, even in practice. She would need every bit of speed she could generate, and her landing would have to be perfect. Treat again, giving herself the maximum possible runway. She closed her eyes and visualized the jump. The push, the flight, the landing. She saw herself completing it successfully, gliding to a stop beside the exit beacon. Opened her eyes and started moving. Boots hit against the ice as she built speed, faster and faster, pushing with all the strength in her legs. The edge of the section rushed toward her like a cliff. She did not slow down. She did not hesitate. She jumped. A moment she was weightless. The frozen chamber stretched out beneath her, beautiful and deadly. The exit beacon glowed ahead, calling her home. Landed hard, too hard. Her boots hit the ice and kept sliding. She was moving too fast, skiing toward the far edge of the landing section. If she went over, there would be nothing but darkness and freezing water below. Threw herself into a spin, using the rotation to bleed off speed. It was a move she had learned years ago on the frozen lakes of Minnesota, a desperate technique for stopping when you were going too fast. She spun once, twice, 3 times, each rotation slowing her down until finally she came to a stop. Was standing on the final section. The exit beacon was less than 5 meters away. The last few steps, her legs were shaking, her lungs burning, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth, but she was smiling. The exit beacon, and a soft chime rang out across the chamber. He had finished. The platform was connected to a heat observation station built into the ice. Academy officials sat behind monitoring screens, tracking the progress of every student in the maze. When walked through the door, still breathing hard from her final jump, every head in the room turned to look at her. The instructor was standing near the main display. His yellow eyes went wide when he saw her. He checked the screen in front of him, then looked at her again, then back at the screen. He seemed unable to believe what the numbers were telling him. Roe had completed the labyrinth in 47 minutes. The previous record was 2 hours and 12 minutes, set by an exchange student 3 years ago, and not just broken the record, she had destroyed it. The instructor walked toward her. His movements were stiff, whether from cold or shock she could not tell. He stopped in front of her and asked how she had done it. His voice was flat, almost accusing. He demanded to know what specialized training she had received, what techniques she had used, what secret advantages she possessed. Still catching her breath, she told him the truth. She said she had grown up skating on frozen lakes. In Minnesota, where she came from, the winters were long and cold. The lakes froze solid for months at a time. Children learned to skate almost as soon as they could walk. It was not spell training. It was just how she had grown up. The instructor stared at her for a long moment. He seemed to be processing her words, trying to fit them into his understanding of humans. Finally, he asked if she was saying that moving on ice was something human children did for fun. She said that where she came from, skating was one of the most popular activities in winter. People did it for exercise, for sport, for entertainment. Professional skaters performed jumps and spins that made what she had done in the maze look simple. The instructor was silent. Around the room, the other officials were whispering to each other. Could hear fragments of their conversation. They were discussing humans, discussing Earth, discussing the implication of what they had just witnessed. The next 3 hours, the remaining students trickled into the observation station. Many required medical attention. They were suffering from hypothermia despite their thermal suits. They had injuries from falls. Several had to be carried in after their cold-slowed bodies became unable to move. Arrived near the end, his feathers bedraggled and his pride clearly wounded. He had finished the maze, but his time was among the worst in the group. He refused to look at when he entered the station. He sat in a corner and did not speak to anyone. She was a respectable time, somewhere in the middle of the rankings. She found immediately and embraced her with all 4 arms. She said that the technique had taught her had saved her. Without it, she would still be stuck in that narrow passage. She was glad it helped, she meant it. Her performance spread quick through the academy. By the time the transport shuttle returned them to the main campus, everyone had heard about the human who skated through the ice maze. Students who had ignored her for months suddenly wanted to talk to her. They asked questions about Earth, about its seasons, about its frozen region. They wanted to understand how a species from such a primitive world could have developed such an extraordinary ability. To explain, but she was not sure they understood. To her, skating on ice was as natural as breathing. She had never thought of it as a survival skill. It was just something she did because it was fun. Academy researchers were more persistent. They called her into a meeting room the day after the evaluation and asked her to describe human cold weather adaptations in detail. They wanted to know about winter clothing, about heating technology, about the psychological effects of extended darkness. They took notes on everything she said. Researcher asked about the cultural significance of ice in human society, thought about the question for a moment, then talked about hockey games and figure skating competition. She talked about children building snowmen and having snowball fights. She talked about the tradition of ice fishing, where people sat on frozen lakes for hours, waiting for fish to bite. Researchers exchanged glances. One of them said it sounded like humans had developed not just tolerance for cold, but genuine enjoyment of it. Most species avoid extreme temperatures whenever possible. Humans seem to seek them out. She said that humans were adaptable. They lived in deserts and rainforests, on mountains and in valleys, in places that were burning hot and places that were freezing cold. They found ways to thrive in almost any environment. And more than that, they found ways to have fun in almost any environment. It ended with an unusual request. The Academy wanted to help design a new training program that would teach other species how to move on ice. They believed that human techniques could be adapted for alien physiology, at least partially. If was willing, she would become the first human instructor at the Galactic Academy of Survival Sciences. It was not something she had ever imagined doing, but it felt right. She had spent 6 months feeling like an outsider, like someone who did not belong. Now she had something valuable to offer, something that no other species in the galaxy could provide. Smith taught her first class. 20 students from a dozen different species gathered in a practice facility with an artificial ice floor. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. She was no longer the primitive human who could not keep up with her peers. She was the person who had conquered the labyrinth. Showed them how to bend their knees, how to shift their weight, how to trust the ice instead of fighting it. The first attempts were clumsy and full of falls, but was patient. She remembered being 4 years old on the frozen lake behind her house, her father holding her hands as she took her first wobbly glides. Everyone had to start somewhere. After the class ended, she walked to a window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, billions of kilometers away, Minnesota was experiencing its own winter. Lakes were freezing, children were learning to skate, families were gathering around warm fires. Smiled. The galaxy was vast and strange and full of wonders she had never imagined, but some things were universal. The joy of gliding on ice, the satisfaction of mastering a difficult skill, the warmth of helping others learn something new. Oh, it was a long way from home, but for the first time, she felt like she had found her place in the universe.